Hi, the following content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are a healthcare provider, please consult with your affiliated institution or local ethics committee for ethical guidance related to clinical practice.
Welcome to Module 11. Hello, David.
Hey, Russ. Ready?
Take it away.
Today, we're going to be talking about the uses of blood spots in research. So California law currently allows, theoretically, parents to opt out, but almost none of them know that they can opt out of the uses for research. So in practice, they don't really have any option. There are people who make a lot of arguments both in favor and against obtaining consent from people for allowing their uses in research, and we're going to just summarize some of those arguments. So first of all, there are some regulatory arguments against using blood spots without consent. First, how is it even possible to use tissue from somebody without their consent? Well, the law allows the use of material as long as it's de-identified. So as long as the researchers don't know who it's from, then under the current regulations that require that we get informed consent for research, which we talked about earlier in the course, those regulations don't apply because unless it's identifiable, it doesn't count as human subjects research. However, for this, and this has really been the basis of why a lot of this blood spot research has taken place. However, and we're going to be talking about this issue of re-identification in much more detail in a future class, but the idea that you could have data and especially genomic data, and claim that it's de-identified has become increasingly problematic. And what that means is that the loophole, in a way, that people have been using to justify research without consent is getting harder and harder to maintain. And some of the new regulations governing research with blood spots explicitly says we should think of these things as identifiable. Therefore, that loophole goes away. In addition to this regulatory argument, there's also an ethical argument against using samples for research without consent. A lot of bioethicists have done studies and surveys, and they show that most of the public wants to be asked for permission before their samples are used. In fact, the people behind the campaigns in Minnesota and in Texas that led to the destruction of their blood spots, what the leaders all said was, I would have consented and let you use my blood spots, but doing it without my permission is just wrong, and therefore we thought that these blood spots should be thrown out, and you shouldn't be allowed to do this unless you ask for permission first. Privacy rights regarding control of this information suggests a violation, so that's a deontological concern that this is a violation of them as individuals. Moreover, it's really important that the public have trust in the research community, and we know that consent can play an important role in that process. A group of researchers led by Jeff Bodkin have done a study of thinking about what the best approach to this is. When they looked at all of the empirical studies of public attitudes, of parental attitudes, when they look at all the guideline statements from professional bodies, as well as actual state policies, they used that as a basis for an expert working group, and the result was that they made some recommendations. Though most people, when you ask them, prefer opt-in consent, where you actually say, can I have permission? The group concluded that opt-out consent was justifiable. That is, you would still ask for permission, but the default would be that they were presumed to be in the research unless they explicitly said, I don't want to be a part of it. And this creates a little bit of a nudge using choice architecture in favor of it.
Just to pause there, I believe there's a ton of data that you get very different numbers of people signing up in opt-in versus opt-out. So even though in theory, saying opt-in or opt-out should lead to the same number, depending if you're making your decisions solely on your preferences, there's a literature that shows that when you opt-in, you get, if it's automatic opt-in, you get way less people than if you automatically opt them out.
That's correct. That's really why choice architecture and preset preferences
Right.
really work to have an impact on people's behavior.
Okay.
But of course, the more robust the opt-out consent is, the more it gets like opt-in, then
Yeah.
the less that impact has.
Right.
And one of the things that some of the researchers found is people who said, I think I should opt in, when explained why they didn't think that was a good idea, because you wouldn't have robust enough numbers, the data wouldn't be as useful, and what if we did a really robust opt-out? Most people come around to saying opt-out would be okay. And so that's more or less the majority view in the bioethics community. But there are some important arguments in favor of using even unconsented blood spots and maybe not requiring consent. Obviously, currently it doesn't count as human subjects under the regulations if it's de-identified, but we've already seen that that may be problematic. But some other arguments in favor include the fact that to some extent, whether you consent or not, there has to be some research-like activities with blood spots, whether there's consent or not. And that's because even to be able to, or to use them for clinical purposes, you have to have quality assurance and quality improvement activities that take place on a regular basis to make sure that the tests really work the way you think they do. And there is no way of opting out of that. So a very research-like activity has to take place anyway, even without research. And that QA/QI work is outside of the regulatory system, and so is allowed to be done. Moreover, one of the worries that a lot of people have about creating even an opt-out consent process is that you'll have less people in the databases, and that will lead to both less data, less robust data, and especially there's a concern that that data may become whiter and more educated and more middle class to affluent. Because in general, when you require consent, even opt-out consent, you wind up getting more people who are white signing up for research, and you wind up having less ethnic and racial minorities and groups that are underrepresented in research traditionally being included. Our colleague Carlos Bustamante, must have been about something like around 8 or 10 years ago, looked at genome-wide association studies, and at that time, they were almost all done on people of European descent. A few years later, it got a little bit better in the US, but it was still about 96% or 94% from people of European descent in that research in the US. And up until now, there's efforts to try and improve that with things like the All of Us research program, but the truth is that most research repositories remain mostly middle-class, educated white people, which we already know a lot about. And when you increase the consent requirements, you make the data more biased.
But
And so
David, if those underrepresented groups don't trust the healthcare research establishment, is it really the right thing to do to say, well, we're going to take that choice away from you?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And that really relates to the question of really what establishes trust. And so the people who want to defend the unconsented blood spots are skeptical that informed consent forms and a few lines in an informed consent form that people barely read and sign or refuse to sign really is a very powerful way of demonstrating respect for the research participants, and that what we need to do is keep these people included in the research, because unconsented blood spots are the most diverse databases that we have from a genomic point of view, but to actually find other more meaningful ways of demonstrating respect for those populations, rather than relying on a few maybe even just a few paragraphs of an informed consent form that's probably not understand unless they're lawyers. There's no evidence that anybody has ever been harmed as a result of a stored sample for decades, so the risk is low. And another thing that's really important is that there's evidence that people do value value the research that's being done. So on the one hand, we want to respect the fact that people are saying, I want to give consent. But people are also saying, when you give those people surveys, I want there to be a robust database of research and for this research to take place. The same surveys show that very clearly. And what's happened is that the bioethics community has basically said, we're going to give priority to one preference over another. But people don't really ask that question. So they don't ask the people like, well, you want the research to take place and you also want to give consent. But those two things may be incompatible to some extent. And if they don't fit together, which do you think is more important? That turns out to be very hard to study. It's not been studied very much, but we've gotten some surprising answers when we've tried to explore some of those issues. In a study that we did, we found that 70% of people said they'd be willing to forego consent or lower the consent requirements in order for research to be possible.
Let me just say that my pen just ran out of ink, so we're on our own from here on out. But keep going.
Okay, so I'll just say that one of the other challenges is when you ask people for consent, if it's very specific consent about each particular research project, that really becomes impossible and would make the research databases useless. Oh, there you go. Got it back working.
I unplugged it and plugged it back in.
Okay, there we go. So specific consent really would make the research unusable because you couldn't ask go back to the database, go back to all the blood spots and try and track everybody down for every time a researcher wanted to use this, which would mean that if you were going to have consent at all, it would have to be a very broad consent, which again, if you're thinking about this as a way of demonstrating respect, telling them, we're going to use your blood spots for research. We don't know exactly what's going to be done with them. There'll be some kind of genomic or genetic analysis done. We can't really predict what it's going to be. It doesn't really tell you very much if you have broad consent. And yet, if you don't, if you try to, as I said, have specific consent for every research project, then it would actually make the research absolutely impossible to take place. So here there's a trade-off. People want to give consent. They want the research to take place and they want to reap its benefits. So studying this issue is really something that we need to do more of to see what people think of. But we also need to be aware of what our options are for trying to have data that's truly diverse and useful for researchers, while also being respectful to participants. There's one last wrinkle I just want to mention, and that is, so far we've been talking about this in the US context, but in at least some other countries, and there's always the potential in this country as well, that there could be negative associations with some of this. So for example, in China, police collected biometric information and samples of 19 million people who were being oppressed, who were Muslims, and using some of these technologies to try and figure out who people were from their DNA, and to try and figure out facial patterns that they would expect to see, what people would look like from their DNA, so they could identify them from seeing them in crowds and things like that. So there's definitely the potential that this technology could be abused by the state or by other commercial entities, and so we need to be aware of the fact that doing this in a respectful manner requires that the uses of it be protected, and some of the mechanisms for doing that include things like having really important and good governance and oversight of this research, so that these kinds of abuses don't take place. And that's it.
That was it. Thank you very much. The issues related to using blood spots for research. Sorry about the little pen issue, but we will stop the share and we will stop the meeting. Thanks.